Hey, Barb, good to have you on.
Yeah.
All right, we're just waiting for, see, we got Michael J. Are you with us, Mike?
I am.
Okay. We got Mick Harrison, David Meiswinkel, Barbara Honegger, myself, and Michael J. Anderson. All right, well, we'll do a countdown and I'll do an introduction and we'll just jump right in unless anybody else has anything you want to say before we start.
Is this live or is it recorded?
No, it's pre-recorded.
Okay.
It'll be played on our radio program, but we do live in the future. We do live radio broadcasts Wednesday and Friday from 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. Pacific time.
Okay.
So you always have a standing invite anytime to come live during that time.
All right.
So we'll start in 5, 4, 3. Well, ladies and gentlemen, this is Scott Bennett and Michael J. on Shell Games coming on Revolution Radio, and this is a special broadcast presentation. We are joined with some wonderful people and experts on the 9/11 issue and the investigation and some of the legal operations that are involved with that. We have Mick Harrison, David Meiswinkel, Barbara Honegger. I think their fantastic work in this area is unparalleled, so we are very lucky to have them, and we're going to be just getting an update on what is happening, where it's happening, who is involved, what's going on, what we can expect in the future. So why don't I open us up and just go right to you, Barbara Honegger, and let you give us an opening and hand it from there. Go ahead, Barbara.
Okay. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, we hear you great. Awesome.
That's great. Well, what I'd like to do, if I could, is turn the mic over first to David and Mick, who are our attorneys, and then I think you should bring me in second or third because they have the details from the legal point of view.
Great. Awesome. Go ahead.
So, David, do you want to start?
Yes. Scott, thanks for having us on. The Lawyers Committee, as you know, is a nonprofit corporation, 501c3, and we're dedicated to transparency and accountability in government. I like to translate that to basically truth and justice. You talk about transparency, you talk about truth, you talk about accountability, you talk about justice. We have a number of actions going or things that we're involved in, and I'll just briefly give you an overview and let Mick fill in the points because we have basically a legal strategy that we're utilizing, and Mick, being the litigation director, is the best to explain that to you. As you know, we have a grand jury petition that was filed last year in the Southern District in Manhattan to the U.S. Attorney Jeffrey Berman, and last year in November, we received confirmation from him that he received and reviewed our petition and that he would comply with 18 U.S.C. 3332 as they relate to the submissions. This is very important, and we would like to take him at his word that he's actually doing that. We will be discussing further in the program, and I'll let Mick introduce that aspect, that we may do a action shortly, a legal action, to make sure we can get some acknowledgement that they in fact are doing that. A few weeks back, Mick and I called the U.S. Attorney's Office. In particular, we spoke with Michael Ferreira, who was Chief Terrorism and International Narcotics Unit head. He had signed the letter on behalf of Jeffrey Berman, and he was very gracious, I thought, respectful, but he told us that he couldn't relate anything to us really other because it was under the federal rules and Article 6, it was a secret. It was secrecy having to do with the grand jury. And so basically he did not acknowledge whether the grand jury had been called or whether it hadn't been called. He just pleaded that he couldn't comment on it anymore. We have an FBI lawsuit down in Washington, D.C. that was filed that is based on the Administrative Procedure Act and mandamus action, which is to compel the FBI to assess information and that was never considered by the original 9/11 Commission. and that has 7 counts to that, and we can go into those counts if you want, and an update, and I'll let Mick update you on that too. So I want to, if I could, a moment in reference to a recent development, see if I can get this up. I want to read you something very important before I turn this over to Mick. And this is from the Franklin Square Munson Fire District 9/11 resolution. And what's important about this, Scott, is that to date, we, in the petition, and along with architects and engineers and others, we claim that the buildings came down because of pre-planted explosives, bombs, controlled demolition in the towers,
Right.
and not because of office fires.
Yes.
And that resolution that was just supported by a fire department, a fire district, is really big news. And it goes like this. Whereas the attacks of September 11, 2001 are inextricably and forever tied to Franklin Square and Munson Fire Department, whereas on September 11, 2001, while operating at the World Trade Center in New York City, firefighter Thomas Hetzel, badge number 290, Hook and Ladder Company number 1, Franklin Square and Munson Fire Department of New York, was killed in performance of his duties along with 2,976 other emergency responders and civilians. Whereas members of the Franklin Square and Munson Fire Department were called upon to assist in the subsequent rescue and recovery operations and cleanup of the World Trade Center site, afflicting many of them with life-threatening illnesses as a result of breathing the deadly toxic present at the site. Whereas the Board of Fire Commissioners of the Franklin Square and Munson Fire Department recognized the significant and compelling nature of the petition before the United States Attorney for the Southern District of New York, reporting unprosecuted federal crimes at the World Trade Center on September 11, 2001, and calling upon the United States Attorney to present that petition to a special grand jury pursuant to the United States Constitution and 18 U.S.C. 3332, whereas the overwhelming evidence presented in said petition demonstrates beyond any doubt that pre-planted explosives and or incinerators, not just airplanes, and the ensuing fires caused the destruction of the 3 World Trade Center buildings, killing the vast majority of the victims who perished that day. Whereas the victims of 9/11, their families, the people of New York City, and our nation deserve that every crime related to the attacks of September 11, 2001 be investigated to the fullest, and that every person who was responsible face justice. And now, therefore, be it resolved that the Board of Fire Commissioners of Franklin Square and Munson Fire District fully supports a comprehensive federal grand jury investigation and prosecution of every crime related to the attacks of September 11, 2011, as well as any and all efforts by other government entities to investigate and uncover the full truth surrounding the events of the horrible day.
That's a powerful, powerful letter that every fire department in America should sign their names to, like the 1776 Declaration of Independence. That's a declaration that every fireman is standing with their brothers as firemen and saying exactly what was just read. Every fire department in America should sign their name to that letter. That's fabulous.
100% right. And now, Scott, I'll turn this over to Mick, and he can fill some of the blanks in and tell you a little bit about our strategies and some of the legal intricacies involved.
Go ahead, Mick. Got you on mute still, pal.
Sorry, I was on mute there, Scott.
Gotcha.
We have a multi-pronged strategy that we're pursuing that does involve federal court litigation. It also involves some federal agency actions. And the idea is that by litigation against the FBI, for example, which we have pending in the federal court in DC, and pursuing the grand jury petition in New York, freedom of information requests and appeals of those requests with various agencies, including NIST, the National Institutes of Standards and Technology, and FEMA, and the FBI itself, and pursuing state records requests, including in New Jersey and Pennsylvania, that we're sort of either going to get a breakthrough through one of those actions, or one of those actions will develop evidence that supports the other. And if all the litigation and agency petitions don't succeed, we think that it's setting the stage for work with Congress. So it's sort of a multi-pronged concept. The key lawsuit we have going at the moment, and Dave mentioned it, is a suit against the FBI. A lot of folks don't know that there was a second 9/11 commission after the original 9/11 commission. The original commission in 2004, basically, how should we say, signed off on the official story and left a lot of the evidence unaddressed, including all the demolition evidence. But in 2014, 10 years later, Congress mandated that the FBI go back and independently assess all evidence regarding 9/11 not considered by the original 9/11 Commission. And in 2015, in March, a commission, which was headed by Ed Meese, appointed by the FBI, did issue a report which purported to comply with the mandate from Congress, but on a close read, again, ignored most of the new evidence regarding 9/11, including all of the demolition evidence, the evidence regarding the high-fivers that were arrested on 9/11, the evidence regarding the photographs and film from and around the Pentagon that no one has seen yet, evidence regarding recovered airplane parts.
And let me just say a quick interjection. I drove by the Pentagon the next day, and Barbara knows this. When I was going to Catholic University doing my doctorate, I drove on George Washington Parkway, and I will never forget looking to my right and seeing a big blue tarp covering a hole. No skid marks on the grass, no plane section, no baggage, no engines, no wheels, nothing of a plane that would have struck the Pentagon was anywhere apparent in my line of sight as I drove by. And every person at the Pentagon that has played a part in this false narrative really is betrayed their oath as a military officer and guilty of treason. That being put aside, I can confirm in my personal experience, I was a witness and will always testify that there was no plane anywhere on the Pentagon grass. I saw it with my own eyes. Go ahead.
Well, we're asking for all the evidence that the DOD and the FBI have to be made available to Congress and then the public, so that we can all make our own judgment about that. The Lawyers Committee is pursuing investigations in several areas. In addition to our lawsuits, we are pursuing active investigations. The Pentagon is one of those areas. Shanksville is another one of those areas where we're investigating. We have not completed those inquiries, but we do anticipate that we are going to petition U.S. attorneys in other jurisdictions, not just in New York. And are you still with me, Scott? Still there, Scott?
Yeah, we're still here.
I think he's there. We're trying to reduce the bandwidth so that our voices are not breaking up. This is an audio call. We don't really need any cameras. This is Michael J.
Yeah, can I make an adjustment there? Let's see, turn video off. Yep, that may help you. So we not only do we have the grand jury petition in New York, which is focused on the demolition of the World Trade Center evidence, and as David said, the U.S. Attorney, somewhat to our surprise, has agreed to comply with the federal grand jury statute, and our reading of that statute means that the U.S. Attorney has agreed to submit all of our evidence to the special grand jury in New York. But in addition to that proceeding, and I'll tell you our backup plan in a moment regarding that, in case it turns out that the U.S. Attorney has not actually complied. But we also intend to, when we finish our investigations regarding the Pentagon and Shanksville, and also regarding a broader pattern of potential government misconduct and possible obstruction of justice, and we have not completed that inquiry, but when we do, we anticipate submitting other petitions for other grand juries, federal grand juries in other jurisdictions. And, you know, the grand jury has powers that we don't have. It has the power to subpoena witnesses. It has the power to offer immunity to witnesses. Working with U.S. attorneys, they can make deals with witnesses, plea agreements, and so forth. So one prong of our strategy is to get the evidence that we have in front of these grand juries and give, 23 regular American citizens the opportunity to use the power of the grand jury to fully get to the bottom of this. Now, regarding the New York grand jury, David indicated that Mr. Ferrara with the U.S. Attorney's Office was unwilling to give us details about the status of that grand jury process, and so we don't really know any more than what the letter we got from the U.S. Attorney tells us, which is they agreed to comply with the statute. So they may be fully submitting our evidence to a special grand jury, or they may not. So we do have a backup plan that David mentioned, and the short version of that plan is we intend to file a lawsuit in federal court in New York to compel the U.S. Attorney to do one or two things. Either to make a disclosure to the court and to us as to the status of that grand jury proceeding so that we can actually know for certain that the grand jury is being given our evidence of the demolition of the Trade Center buildings on 9/11. And so one components of this legal action is a motion for disclosure so that we know exactly what's happening. If it turns out that the U.S. Attorney has fully complied, which is our hope, that disclosure would be the end of that lawsuit, because it would convince us that, in fact, what we petitioned for is happening, and the grand jury is getting a chance to look at this evidence. Beyond that point, it's up to the grand jury what they do. Now, if the disclosure shows that the U.S. Attorney has not, for whatever reason, given our petition evidence to the grand jury, there is a federal law, federal mandamus statute, which allows citizens to sue federal officials when they have failed to perform a mandatory duty, emphasize the word mandatory, non-discretionary. And so our backup legal option in this same lawsuit, if in fact it is disclosed that there has not been compliance by the U.S. Attorney, we do intend to ask the federal judge for an order compelling the U.S. Attorney to give our petition evidence regarding the demolition of the Trade Center towers on 9/11 to the special grand jury. And Scott, you've probably seen our petition by now. It's 50-some pages, a lot of details of the scientific evidence,
Yes.
supported by 50-some exhibits. So it's a very persuasive, or in our view, compelling, dispositive collection of evidence of federal crimes that have yet to be prosecuted. And unfortunately, the demolition of those buildings dramatically increased the casualty count at the Trade Center on 9/11. So it's a very serious matter regarding crimes that had very serious consequences and have yet to be not only yet to be prosecuted, yet to be fully investigated by the federal government. So the mandamus action, we expect to file it by this anniversary of September 11th, and we'll keep you updated on how things go on that. In addition to the grand jury petitions and the FBI lawsuit, and just a reminder, the goal of the FBI lawsuit is to force the FBI to do what Congress has already ordered them to do, which is to evaluate all the evidence regarding 9/11 that the original commission in 2004 failed to consider. So it's essentially the Lawyers Committee, with some help from our co-plaintiffs and a lot of help from the architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth and the larger network. But the goal is to basically force the FBI to do what Congress ordered. So we're sort of doing our best to help Congress achieve what it has already stated it wants, which is to be fully informed on all of the evidence regarding 9/11, and that has yet to happen. And because that hasn't happened, the American public has yet to be fully informed.
Brother, I have a question for you concerning this suit. Can anyone else in America, especially people who have had sons and daughters injured in the ongoing terror wars, can they join this lawsuit at any time? Or is this a closed issue as far as, the kind of support you need and what it would mean for people to actually believe that there could be justice in this situation?
That's a good question. The short answer is legally, it's a definite maybe as an answer to your question. We do have a right to amend our lawsuit One of the updates that David wanted me to give you, which I'll give you now, is that the government has filed a motion to dismiss in that case a couple of days ago, and our response will be due in a couple of weeks, maybe, unless we get an extension, maybe a few weeks. But we have a right to amend within 21 days of that motion to dismiss being filed. So we have not quite 3 weeks now to amend. We could amend our complaint and add new plaintiffs, which would be the direct response to your question. Now, whether those plaintiffs, the new plaintiffs, would survive a motion to dismiss, I don't know the answer to that without probably putting it in front of the judge and finding out, because the government might take the position that the statute of limitations has run for those newly added plaintiffs, and the court might take the position that those amendments relate back to the original filing time, which was timely, or that it's sort of a moot issue because there are enough plaintiffs who filed timely that it doesn't matter whether we add additional plaintiffs, sort of symbolically. So I don't actually know. Yeah.
Let me interject, because as we know, there's all sorts of written there's written laws, policies, in extenuating circumstances, in the interests of justice, quote unquote. If there is a miscarriage of justice, all of the procedures and the timeliness and the dates of filings and things like that, the technicalities of the legal process, are ruled subservient to the interests of justice. And this seems to be a heinous example of the interests of justice being subjugated under procedure, as well as a heinous example of the government, if I'm listening to you correctly, the government of the United States and the Department of Justice is actively seeking to dismiss a lawsuit or a motion that is trying to compel the investigation, the revelation, the prosecution of one of the greatest acts of terrorism, domestic terrorism potentially, on American soil.
Yeah. Well, you did hear me correctly. The federal government is trying to dismiss our lawsuit, which is simply trying to get the FBI to do what Congress ordered them to do. The government is arguing that, well, you know, they may have said this, but it wasn't really mandatory. They didn't mean it. We didn't have to do it. And also that, strangely, they're saying that none of our plaintiffs, which include 9/11 family members, architects and engineers, and the lawyers committee, that none of us have standing to pursue these claims. So it'll be an interesting thing to see how that plays out. I agree with your general proposition that the federal rules, at least, are flexible enough. There is this basic rule, I think it's actually Rule 1, that says the courts can basically waive the requirements of the other rules when justice and equity require, in order to promote, you know, and achieve substantial justice. Courts don't invoke that rule very often, and sometimes I think they've forgotten about it. It is still there. Now, the statute of limitations, however, which are, for folks who don't know, the time deadlines for filing a particular type of lawsuit, which are set in usually by a statute, and in the federal system by an act of Congress. Those statutes of limitation can either be jurisdictional or non-jurisdictional. And without getting too technical, if they're non-jurisdictional, sorry, my phone is driving me crazy here. So if they're non-jurisdictional, what you just said could be done. The requirements could be waived. There could be an equitable doctrine called equitable tolling invoked. Also, an alternative procedure, which exists for all the additional plaintiffs that you're contemplating that might want to be added. They could move to intervene in the case, and notwithstanding the statute of limitations, I believe they could be allowed to intervene, or at least become a friend of the court and have their voice heard. And the last resort is we're always open to getting feedback from folks who aren't official plaintiffs, and anyone who wants to input into this lawsuit can contact me or contact David, and we can make sure that, you know, their thoughts are considered. If you have information you think would be helpful, please forward it to us. We can include it in the lawsuit. So there are a number of ways that folks might still have their voice heard.
Please give us some phone numbers and or emails or websites. This is an important thing.
Well, let me give you mine, and I'll defer to other people if they want their numbers out there. Mine's already out there. so I'll give it again. My phone number for Mick Harrison, Litigation Director for the Lawyers Committee, 812-361-6220. You can go to our website, www.lcfor911.org. That's LC for 911.org. And you can communicate with us through the website. There's an email option there. You can email me directly if you want. My email is my name, Mick Harrison, ESQ, @gmail.com. That's MICKHARRISON, @gmail.com. And I'll leave it to my colleagues when they next grab the microphone if they want to share their contact information, but that should be enough to get folks started.
And let me say one more thing. Besides, give us that website again, the LC 911 website. But I also want to just interject: is this something that you anticipate the Attorney General, Barr, the Inspector General, other parties who have mastery executive positions in the Justice Department realm stepping in, whether it's the Office of Professional Responsibility or Special Counsel or something like that, to make sure, to exercise oversight? This isn't just a legal process. This is a constitutional crisis, potentially exposing a domestic enemy, an example of treason and civil war in America that is compelling and absolutely has to be fully disclosed to the American people in the sunlight of truth. Go ahead.
Well, that's a fascinating question and an interesting one. The federal government is complex, and there are components of the executive branch that are intended to oversee other components of the executive branch. And of course, each branch is supposed to oversee the other. In regard to your specific question, the Attorney General has already been served this complaint, and the U.S. Attorney, and the U.S. Attorney has appeared on behalf of the FBI. The FBI, of course, was served. I have not seen any indication that the Office of Professional Responsibility or the Inspector General, which both have some oversight responsibility.
Yes.
I haven't seen any indication of their involvement, and there's nothing to keep anyone listening to this call, including you, Scott, if you wish, from petitioning the Inspector General of the Department of Justice or the Office of Professional Responsibility in DOJ and asking them to take a look at this lawsuit and the government's response to see if they're meeting their not only statutory obligations, but their ethical obligations.
Absolutely, especially given what they've just been doing for the past, 2 years in this Russia hoax issues. There are significant doubts in the integrity of the Department of Justice, and this could be something that could be victimized by them.
I'd like to make a big picture comment at some point here. It's Barb.
I'm fine with that, Barb.
Okay. Okay with you, Scott?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Go ahead, please.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm glad we heard from our attorneys first. I'd like to make kind of big picture comments. My first comment is I just want to remind people, bouncing off of your last statement, Scott, that Robert Mueller himself, up until recently special counsel in the Trump-Russia investigation by the special counsel's office under the Department of Justice, that he was the FBI director beginning about 5 days before 9/11, on 9/11, and for years afterwards. So he was in the catbird seat, as we like to call it, for the cover-up of the truth about 9/11, or at the very minimum, not putting out the whole truth, and that's a gross understatement, about what really happened on 9/11 and who really attacked our country. The other big picture statement I'd like to make, and I'm going to make this as an individual citizen, not on behalf of the Lawyers Committee, and that is, it's incredibly timely what is happening here with all of these legal actions, in particular because after the mass shootings of the last few days, and we now know that the last two in Dayton and Texas were the 254th and 255th mass shootings in the United States in this year alone, 2019. And the big debate in Congress and in the mainstream media and the alternative media right now is, why aren't these officially in our federal law referred to as domestic acts of terrorism instead of just mass shootings, something like that? And they're not. Technically, in the law, according to all of the analysis and pundits that I've heard and read in the last couple of weeks, approximately, when this has been focused on, have made it clear that our federal law, the text of our federal law, does not yet define any of these mass shootings as acts of domestic terrorism. The word terrorism is not used in the federal statute for these mass murder acts that happen on our own soil. And so that's why 9/11 is so critically important. Because, and again, I'm making this statement as a private citizen and an investigator of 9/11 for almost 19 years, personally. And that is that the evidence, in my mind, is overwhelming that 9/11 is, in fact, itself an act of domestic terrorism. Once the public, and especially the members of Congress, understand this, and from my point of view, that's one of the main reasons for doing what I'm doing with everything here, it will make a tremendous difference in that debate, I believe. That once people understand 9/11 itself was a grotesque Hitlerian level act of domestic terrorism, there should be no more question whatsoever that any of these mass murders in the United States should also be in that our federal statutes, our federal law should be changed such that they are acknowledged as acts of domestic terrorism, as act of terrorism on domestic soil. So I wanted to make that clear.
Yeah, that is a great point, Barbara. They are trying to pass that domestic terrorism 864 bill. Durbin is sponsoring it, and this is, of course, as you said, the number one thing that should be exactly represented by such a bill. That's precisely what's needed. This was a case of domestic terrorism, I believe, and any failure to fully expose that delegitimizes the right of any government entity to claim jurisdiction or authority over the American citizen.
And it also robs every one of the victims and victim survivors and the victims' family members of those who died in these 255 mass shootings this year, 2019 alone. It robs them of the power of the law to bring justice to all of these massive numbers of our fellow American citizens.
Yeah, I think it's a brilliant observation. I'll let you continue. Mick, you were commenting. Did you want to continue, or did you want to open it up more? Go ahead.
Well, I'm happy to open it up to you and Dave and Michael, others. I think you've got the gist of what we're trying to do, which is a multi-pronged strategy, investigative litigation, public education, Congress. Eventually, the media hasn't been giving us very much attention, unfortunately, and we expect a breakthrough sooner or later on that. So I'm fine to take some questions.
Let me share one thing that's been developing on the international scope of 9/11. When I went over, and I think I shared with this before, when I went over to Iran, and I didn't realize 9/11 was an inside job really until I had been thrown in jail by the Obama administration for exposing its terrorist financing operations with the Clinton Foundation and the Clinton State Department and the Department of Justice, and Renee Alexander Acosta, who was a part of that. I wrote about that in my book, Shell Game, and I interviewed Brad Birkenfeld, and Edward Snowden was a part of that. He was Booz Allen Hamilton with me. But that put aside, I didn't discover 9/11 until I was thrown in prison and really started discovering a lot of the stuff and reading it. But here's what happened when I was in Iran last year. There was significant discussion about 9/11 being a false flag, Iran having nothing to do with it, the Saudis, the CIA, the Mossad, all of these things were being discussed, and Kevin Barrett was playing a very good role, and various people in the Iranian media, government, academia, media, they were all talking about this. And now we see that very conference, the New Horizon Conference, being sanctioned and made illegal for Americans to go to, or they'll be threatened with throwing in jail for 20 years and fined $1 million by Sigal Mandelker, the Israeli American director of the Office of Foreign Assets and Financial Intelligence at the Treasury Department, Sigal Pearl Mandelker, is unilaterally declaring sanctions on this New Horizon conference, which is probably one of the greatest allies, indirect allies, for fomenting this disclosure of truth about 9/11. And Mnuchin and other people in the Trump administration are seemingly pushing that. So I just wanted to, insert the Iran dimension and this hope, this sanctioning and things. I think is a massive attempt to cover a lot of this 9/11 stuff up, and I'd be interested to see how this could be used to crowbar in or shoehorn in and help your legal battle with this. The enemy of my enemy is my friend, and our enemy are those forces, as Barbara said, who are denying us justice, sending us on this global endless war of terror, and violating and turning America into this police state, using 9/11 as our boogeyman, as our license. Go ahead.
So I'm not hearing my colleagues, so I'll jump in. This is Mick. It's disturbing for the federal government to attempt to restrict what its citizens do, either in travel or association, right of association, which I believe is still in the First Amendment, free speech. So I haven't investigated the details of all that's being done to try to, preclude folks from having this sort of communication in and with Iran, but it's a problem that goes beyond Iran, and we've seen intrusions into our civil liberties related to 9/11 in a number of areas, including illegal surveillance.
Yes.
So, we haven't adopted a position on that particular issue yet, so I can't speak for the Lawyers Committee on it. But personally, as a lawyer and a public interest lawyer, it always concerns me when the government attempts to restrict what its citizens do, particularly when what they're doing is attempting to bring more truth out about a matter of public concern. So that's as far as I can go on it at the moment.
Right. Scott, we have, because we're chartered as a nonprofit organization, we have to be somewhat careful as to how we move. And
Sure.
As individuals, as Mick said, we can make statements or be ourselves. And we are all very concerned about the encroachments on all the civil liberties in this country, in particular since 9/11. And as Mick mentioned, the surveillance, the undermining of the First Amendment and the Fourth Amendment and other amendments is very alarming. But because we are that nonprofit and we can't show a face of politics in any way, we try to stay somewhat neutral in that regard.
Yeah.
But unless we take a resolution and pass it as a board. So if we would say the Lawyers Committee supports this, well, that means we support it because our members, we discussed it, we reviewed it, and we voted on it. And then this is our policy. There are so many issues out there that are so important that we haven't addressed, okay? And but what we have addressed here is what you've seen right now is these two lawsuits. They just didn't snap our fingers and they happened. We had to discuss this, and we had to put the information and the evidence together. So we have that grand jury petition down in New York City in the Southern District, and we have the FBI lawsuit in Washington, D.C., because there was a vote with the board of directors. Now, with regards to all these other things that are happening, certainly it's good that citizens be aware of it and do what they have to do legally to address it in conferences or in proposals or in whatever action, but that is lawful. But and we, as an individual, I would certainly 100% support that. So these are times they're slippery slopes and dangerous times for freedom. So we all have to be aware of that. And if we can unlock this door having to do with 9/11, we may find the opportunity and the leverage that we need to address all these other problems.
Brother,
Yeah.
are there parallel movements like with the lawyers, or rather the 9/11 architects and engineers? Are there parallel movements that are approaching from a different direction, like petitions or confronting people in Congress to look at this right now? And would you suggest that that's a possibility, that's a necessity at this time? Because it seems like we need, as Americans, we need to understand that our voice is very important, and the lack of our voice actually allows these people the illusion that these things don't really matter to the American people.
Well, I'm not sure what movements are going on out there. I think we're at this Spears Point is the Architects and Engineers and the Lawyers Committee right now. Unfortunately, I'd like to say that there are a lot of other groups at that point, but I'm not sure they are. Now, Barbara might be able to fill us in on that more. She has a more access maybe to what's happening grassroots-wise, but maybe we should look at it historically in this point that in some ways that the awareness is now just breaking. There was almost like post-traumatic stress disorder in this country for so many years, right? So
with
now
engineered post-traumatic stress disorder.
yeah, what I read before with the proclamation from the fire department, now that's a historical document. That's the first of a kind. And that is a fireman. They lost on that day. There was the responders, first responders in New York City. 343 firemen were killed. There was 27 police officers, I believe, or 23 police officers in New York City. I think there was 37 Port Authority officers. There was 8 EMT personnel, and there was even one person on a boat, a New York City fireboat, I believe, that was killed. So this is now the first time, and this has happened a week or two ago, that the fire department now is saying there's pre-planned explosives in the building. Now that just opens everything up, and it'll catch on. See, the iceberg now is starting to thaw in that area. So once that starts to thaw in that area and the firemen get on board, boy, oh boy, that's going to be fairly exciting, I think.
Well, what you've done, and from a psychological warfare perspective, you've tapped into the hidden heroes of America. You've tapped into the Batman syndrome, the firemen and the police department.
100% right. And Scott, maybe the listeners don't know, but a part of our exhibits, we have 57 exhibits in our grand jury petition. The petition itself, 52 pages. The exhibits are 57. One of the exhibits is a statement of 118 firemen who say they experienced explosions, bombs, controlled demolition while they were in the buildings. All right, they say that. Now, those firemen, as you said, and you're right on, they were written out of history so far. None of them testified at the 9/11 commission. They weren't asked about what they experienced in those buildings.
See, this is the clear and present danger moment when Harrison Ford reappears at the end of the film and testifies before the Senate. These are the heroes of America, not the military, but the real heroes of domestic fighting, and that is the firemen and the police department.
Are definitely, and you can hear on one of the tapes, I'm not sure who it was, but one of the, I don't know if it was a fire chief, but I think he's up on the 70-some floor, and he says, just get us another line up where we've taken care of the fire. There's a little more to do. That's under control. And then the building goes. The building goes. It was pulled at that time. They had it under control up that time. That's what it sounded like. But anyway, the firemen now are, they're, I'm going to say waking up, but they're looking at it in a different way. And when you look at it a different way, you get different feelings. All right. And your feeling of maybe betrayal, being lied to, as being made a fool of, being used, being abused, and maybe the finer sentiments of ourselves as Americans start to surface. That would be, I think, a dream come true for all of us involved. If people would go back to our Constitution and Bill of Rights and see how they've been trampled on and disrespected by those who have engineered these events.
Well, brother, it's an ongoing wounding. I would like you to address how many people have been actually dying from their exposure to toxicity. This is the domestic thing, and how many people have died as a result of this psychological operation in order to facilitate the 7 nations in 5 years plan with respect to going after, quote, terrorists, when the domestic terrorists are actually, they're not in prison. We know that George Herbert Walker Bush was involved in this, but Mr. Cheney is not in prison. He was involved. The reality, though, is that people have been dying from these ongoing horrendous conditions because of their exposure to the toxic environment in that area. Can you please share that?
Could I respond to that? Because there's something I really want to say about
Please.
responding to what Scott said earlier.
Yes, please.
Go ahead. Okay. First, to respond to the last question, and that is the bad news is we're talking about literally tens of thousands of people who are dying from the toxic dust and other horrendous conditions at Ground Zero. And that's been made very, very public recently. That's the bad news. The good news, of course, is that Congress finally came around, thanks to Jon Stewart, amongst others, in the congressional hearings with dying members of the first responders, including one first responder who died only days after the congressional hearing recently. The good news is that Congress has now passed a law that will cover the health conditions, the health care of all of these first responders, and, by the way, citizens who live in the surrounding area, for, I believe it's another 90 years, something like that. So that's the good news. But the main comment I wanted to make to Scott's comment about how the fire commissioners from Long Island, that this critical resolution that they just voted on unanimously, by the way, all 5 fire commissioners from this ladder in Long Island, has started the ball rolling down the hill. And what to me is so important about that, as Scott, you said that this is tapped into the domestic hero, the Batman syndrome,
Yes.
across the United States. I wanted to go beyond that because you and I, Scott, on many of your programs before, I've been on many times, you and I have focused on the criticality of bringing both veteran military officers and enlisted into the 9/11 Truth Movement in huge numbers, but also in particular active duty officers and enlisted military personnel. And what's important to me about this resolution is that these men are uniformed officers. And in the interview that the lead fire commissioner gave to Free Fall Radio, which is associated with Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth recently, and you can both listen to that whole interview. It's historic, as well as read the transcript if you don't want to take the time to listen to the audio on the Architects and Engineers website, and that's ae911truth.org. Please do so. You will hear the lead fire commissioner who initiated the resolution that was passed by his fellow fire commissioners unanimously just recently. You will hear him say that he considers firemen, and in particular the fire commissioners, the uniformed officers of these fire departments in New York, he considers them, and he called them, paramilitary personnel.
Yes.
So take off the word para. These are officered personnel, and our military personnel will identify with them. It's
That's
a
right.
brotherhood and now a sisterhood also. But these are the people I believe will make the difference when they come around in large numbers. And I'm not sure that Dave Meiswinkel mentioned this. If he did, forgive me for repeating it, but I think it's worth repeating, if so, that the lead fire commissioner has said in the interview, and I believe also in the actual fire commissioners meeting, which you can also see the video of on the Architects and Engineers website, ae911truth.org, he said that these fire commissioners, these 5 fire commissioners, are now going to take it upon themselves to go to the dozens and dozens and dozens of other volunteer fire ladders, fire stations in New York, and bring all the volunteer ones around. And then the volunteer ones are going to go in mass to the New York City Fire Department. And the difference between the two is that the New York City Fire Department, the personnel there are paid. They are not volunteer, which is the big reason that they have been resisting going public for 9/11 Truth publicly for so long. They're afraid of losing their salaries. They're afraid of losing their pensions, and they're afraid of losing the ability to pay for their kids' college tuition. So it's the fact that this breakthrough has happened because these fire commissioners work with a volunteer fire ladder. And that's what matters. They call themselves and think of themselves as part of the military and paramilitary or quasi-military brotherhood. And that's what we need to bring around with all the facts.
Yeah.
And just to qualify that too, a lot of them that are volunteer, they're like sort of in the suburbs out in Long Island, right outside of Queens. But they do two things. They work as paid firemen in New York City, but they're also volunteers in their home community. So they sort of play, two roles. So they have that connection. It's not like they're removed from New York City. They have all their brothers are back and forth. A lot of them are paid firemen, and they're volunteers in their own community. That's my understanding. And talking with the Commissioner Joya, who's the reference that Barbara made.
Again, this is about also these firemen and first responders. Many of them are continuing to lose people from the horrifying infections, those things that have been taking their lives with respect to the terrible substances in the air. Now, this is an ongoing thing that's affecting how many people? I mean, their families, their children, their grandchildren. This is an ongoing wounding of this community. And I think that the firemen and first responders they're going to bring the necessary incentive to make sure this movement does whatever is necessary to get justice. What do you think?
Yes, I think so. And in reference to what you're talking about, you have Mick Harrison here who actually defended a whistleblower, Kate Jenkins, from the EPA and won the case. And she had said the thing that she said that got her in trouble in part, and Mick, you have to correct me on that, was she said the quality of air was like breathing Drano. And that was like startling. So that's what they put these guys into. And then Mick, you might want to comment on that in case
I just mentioned that my client had disclosed to Congress and the FBI the toxic and caustic dangers of the Trade Center dust, and that it was much more dangerous than had been disclosed. We're now, of course, learning that the hard way for the reason that you just mentioned. I think it was Michael who just mentioned that we're losing so many good folks in the ranks of the firefighters and police, even in the FBI. We're losing people because of their exposures on 9/11, and I'm afraid that's true for some in the surrounding communities of the civilians. So, the government, and instead of sort of praising my client and doing their best to get the word out to the first responders, they basically just tried to cover it up and they fired her. And that's what we're dealing with. Now we solved her immediate employment problem, but the bigger problem continues, as you say.
And you mentioned too that we're talking about the home front, but overseas, the millions of people have been killed, and in part we began with Iraq with weapons of mass destruction. And I mean, I don't know how we can in any way justify that slaughter. There's no justification. At least I'm speaking personally in my mind. And as you mentioned before too about the 7 countries in 5 years that Wesley Clark, I believe, had spoken about.
The exposure, yes.
Yeah, that became a prophecy that was fulfilled, basically. So the pre-knowledge and the forethought to do what that was done. I mean, how can we justify that as Americans? That's the problem. We have, and again, I'm speaking as myself, not as for Lawyers Committee. We have a government that's not representing our interest as Americans. We're doing things that Americans shouldn't be doing. And if we had all the truth out there, all the facts out there, we certainly wouldn't be doing it. And those people wouldn't be the ones that be leading, because we'd have good leaders in there, which we unfortunately, we have problems with.
Is there something that can be printed out and taken to our local fire departments to let them know, or do you think that this is spreading? Please forgive the pun, like a fire among departments all over America? Because how many times have we seen these posters or stickers on the bumper stickers on the back of our local fire departments about we support, the 911 heroes, but this is an ongoing wounding. Or is there something that people can do to duplicate the report and bring it to their local fire departments?
Well, they could take that proclamation. If they go on the ae911truth.org, you can pull that up. That's Franklin Square Munson Fire Department, Nassau County. The 5 commissioners voted on that. I think it was July 24th, not too long ago, a few weeks back, and print it up and get it out. As that piece of literature that I just read at the beginning of the show, and you commented on, Scott, that's very powerful, and that says it all. This is firemen saying that, pre-planted explosives. That this firemen saying that, not lawyers or architects or police. Well, it could be police.
That's right. It's awakening the sleeping giant that Americans have been waiting for and desperate and looking for and searching out. When is the sleeping giant going to awake? And that is the firemen who wore the uniform, who have the paramilitary discipline, who have the chain of command, who have taken an oath to this country and the Constitution. And it goes even above politics. It goes to the blood and lives of protecting people from fire and tragedy that goes back in time immemorial. And that character is something that heroes are made of. And I think you are awakening a hero spirit in America that has not been ever woken up. Maybe in World War II, but I would say this could even this pales everything in comparison, because this really does ominously reflect, but better, what Bush tried to say. They'll hear from all of us soon. This actually will be all of America and the heroes standing up and exposing the greatest lie, the greatest act of murder, the greatest act of slow poisoning, as well as the greatest act of military abuse and conquest around the world. This could be the one thing that turns America upside down, shakes out all of these parasites and criminals, and perhaps triggers a renaissance in America. Now, I know we're getting close on time, so I wanted to give you your last closing comments on how we can support you, what's coming up. Again, anything that people can do to be a part of your work. Go ahead.
I think one of us needs to, or all of us need to talk about the events for the 9/11 anniversary coming up at the end here.
Amen, Barbara.
Yeah.
Yeah, we got to do that quick because I don't know how much time you have.
Okay, so Dave, why don't you go ahead with what you know, and then I'll add about Zurich, Switzerland.
Well, both Barbara, Mick, and myself, we'll all be at events in 9/11. We'll be in different locations. We're organizing right now in New York City. A major event will be September 7th. And one of the speakers will be Commissioner Joya. And he is from that Franklin Square Munson Fire Department. And we'll be doing on that date, the plan is to do a roll call of all the firemen and first responders that were killed in 9/11. We have also speaking, at least the committed, Richard Gage from Architects and Engineers, Mick Harrison, our litigation director, William Binney, whistleblower from NSA, will be there, and others. The whole program is not set up yet, but it should be quite a program. And as you said, Scott, maybe this will start to wake people up, but we expect Commissioner Joya to be there.
Yeah, it's very.
I'll jump in with what's happening in Europe. Very exciting. And Scott, I will send you, if I haven't already, don't use the flyer poster that I've already sent you. I'll send you the most recent one for posting, if there's a place to post with the video of this radio show.
Sure.
So on September 11th itself, on the 19th, well, is it the 19th anniversary? I thought 18th anniversary. Anyway, yeah, I guess the 18th anniversary. On September 11th of this year, 2019, there will be a major event in Zurich, Switzerland. We're very excited about it. I'm co-organizing and co-producing the event in Zurich on September 11th with Jan van Aken, who is the leader of the 9/11 Truth Action Project, also known as 9/11 TAP, TAP for all of Europe. We're co-producing this event. It will begin at 1 p.m. Doors open at noon. Event goes from 1 to 7:30 p.m. Very exciting at the Volkshaus. That's spelled Volkshaus. It means the House of the People or the People's House in central Zurich. It seats 950 people. We're hoping to fill the house. And we want everyone on your show to help us do that. As soon as I have the flyer, the final flyer, which can also be made into a poster, I'm going to send it to you to send to all your lists, Scott, so that they in turn send to people that they know in Europe, in particular in the Germanic speaking areas of Europe. The event will be in English. Very exciting. Our keynote speaker is Professor Daniel Ganser. Dr. Ganser is the world's foremost authority on the false flag domestic terrorism attacks called Operation Gladio in Europe during the Cold War, which his books, in particular NATO's Secret Warriors, his first book, links directly to the Pentagon and NATO. Mass murders of innocent European civilians to blame on left-wing politicians before elections to try to make sure that the center or the right wing won those elections. They've been doing this for a very, very long time.
Yeah.
And personally, I believe that 9/11 was an American Gladio attack. By many
Irving Kristol, Bill Kristol's father, played the key role in those European operations in the 50s and the 60s. So
he played a key role. Yes, he did. Not from the military side, and then the other, from the civilian side. The
CIA. He was CIA.
Yeah, CIA.
Well.
Civilian side. Yeah. The other major event that I do want to mention, and there are two others in New York besides our Lawyers Committee event on September 7th. That, by the way, will be at the Community Church in New York on Saturday, September 7th from 6 to 9 p.m. It might go a little later if we can get many or other exciting speakers, and that's the event that Dave Meiswinkel just mentioned to you from the Lawyers Committee.
And let me say this: you just hit another bell, Barbara. You're great at these clashing of symbols, because when you're awakening the hero of the Batman firemen, you are also creating an opportunity to wake up the American churches and to have them stand up and support this, either financially or through supporting their fire departments, or just getting the word out and being educated and visiting their members of Congress and demanding that they play a part of this. The American church has been sleeping and has been lobotomized regarding 9/11 and so many other problems.
Perhaps sleeping giant. You're absolutely right.
Perhaps this is the way to wake them up, because they claim to love America, the American churches, and I've been part of it for a long time. But the firemen waking up could be the final straw that breaks their back and wakes them up and forces them to take a position.
Or motivates them voluntarily to take a position. Now, before we end the show, I want people to know the other exciting major event for 9/11 Truth on the 9/11 anniversary this year, September 11th, 2019. And that is the Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth event. It will be, as it's scheduled now, it will start at 9:30 a.m. Washington, D.C. time in the nation's capital at the National Press Club. And the speakers will, of course, be Richard Gage. Very exciting. It will also be at least one, if not more, of the fire commissioners will be there, including the lead fire commissioner that Dave Meiswinkel just mentioned. I can't pronounce his name.
I hope they invite President Trump, Barbara. Go on.
Yeah, allow me to continue, please. And the other major speaker who is invited will be Dave Meiswinkel, representing the Lawyers Committee. Why is that important? It's important because the Fire Commissioner's resolution that they passed unanimously recently, explicitly in the text of the resolution, states that they're doing it because of to support the Lawyers Committee petition for a World Trade Center grand jury. So that's going to be a very exciting event. Also, Bob McIlvaine will be present. He, of course, lost his son Bobby at World Trade Center 1 on 9/11 and is a plaintiff in our lawsuit against the FBI and is also a critical individual for our World Trade Center grand jury petition in New York City. So that's a very exciting event, National Press Club, September 11th, 9:30 in the morning for about an hour and a half. And you will get all the details on that on the Architects and Engineers website now, if not soon. And that is Architects and Engineers website again is ae911truth.org. And our Lawyers Committee website again is lcfor911.org. And thank you so much for this opportunity to get the word out.
The September 7th, the Saturday, September 7th event in New York City will be live streamed across the country, around the world.
So
Yeah.
Thank you very much. So will the Zurich event on September 11th. However, it's because of the time difference of 9 hours from the West Coast and 6 hours from the East Coast. It won't be a very comfortable time for many of us here in the United States, but it will be very quickly up on YouTube in a professional videotape, a professional YouTube that I will give you the link to Scott as soon as we have it.
Mick has something to announce too. Mick's going to be somewhere.
Well, I am speaking at an event on September 11th in California. The Northern California 9/11 Truth Alliance does their annual film festival, and they'll have two key speakers. I'll be one, and I've unfortunately forgotten the name of the gentleman who's there from Project Censored from Sonoma State University, which deals with all the most censored media stories each year. And that's an interesting presentation, and they've dealt with some 9/11 related censorship issues. So I encourage folks to tune into that as well. I'm sure it'll be on the web afterwards.
Yeah, that's a great event.
It's also going to be live streamed by noliesradio.org. So it will be live streamed by www.noliesradio.org by our great associate and colleague, Alan Reese, who does that for us for many 9/11 events, including the 9/11 Film Festival every year. And for people who are in the area, that's in Oakland, California, the film festival at the Grand Lake Theater in Oakland, California. I believe, Mick, if you can correct me, it usually starts at 1 p.m. and goes to about 10 p.m.
I think that's correct, but I don't have it in front of me, so I don't want to absolutely confirm. And Scott, I'd like to add just one thought in closing, if I could.
Yes, please.
So on this issue that you raised about the firefighters and maybe the police waking up and maybe ultimately the churches, which I think is a huge point, in terms of the firefighters and their way of looking at 9/11, once, and this applies to other folks as well, but particularly for the firefighters, once you come to grips with the fact that explosives were placed in the buildings and were detonated on 9/11. And that's what our petition to the grand jury is about. That's the evidence that the firefighters, Commissioner Joya and his colleagues found persuasive. Once you come to grips with that as a fact, then you have to think about what are the implications of that fact. And because explosives have now been proven, scientifically proven, to have been used at the Trade Center on 9/11, and that's why the two towers collapsed in Building 7. And of course, the towers are where we had such a horrible loss of life, and a large proportion of that loss was due to the fact that the buildings collapsed. If they had not collapsed, more folks would have survived. Not all, but more, and certainly more of the firefighters would have survived. And so you may recall there was on 9/11, one of the firefighters had heroically climbed, I don't know how many stairs, how many floors, and gotten to a point where a couple of the fires existed and radioed in and said, we could get a couple lines up here, we can knock down these two fires, and basically was announcing that, these fires can be brought under control. And literally, I believe it was within seconds, certainly minutes after that call came in, the building he was in collapsed, as I recall. And, I think the disturbing reality of this is that whoever planned to use explosives in these buildings planned to kill firefighters. They may have timed the detonation, which they were, in control of when these buildings were detonated and demolished. They could have waited, and they could have waited till all the firefighters were out, and they chose not to. It's possible, we're still investigating this aspect, and the grand jury, I hope, it's possible that that radio call from that firefighter could have prompted the timing of the demolition of those buildings, because they did not want other firefighters to come in and come to realize that the fires were not that severe and could be put out. And that would blow their cover story for the demolition of the building. So I think the firefighters, are unfortunately part of the plan to motivate the American people to go to war. That's what it looks like to me, and I'll speak for myself at the moment.
I agree.
And so
they put the firemen up in a position where they were erecting the flag like the Marines on Iwo Jima. Well, if you're going to awaken that kind of fighting spirit, you better be prepared for them to come back at those who did this whole lie and deception operation. You are awakening something that I am in awe of, because I know the implications of this and how it is going to reverberate. It is going to knock down every house of cards of deception that they have tried to erect over 18 years. Go ahead.
Well, I think you sort of punctuated my point there. So I just wanted to say that the firefighters, once they come to grips with this reality, need to realize that they've been used and that their colleagues have been killed for a political purpose, a terroristic purpose, as Barb says. And once I think that reality sets in, I think we are going to see the firefighters become much more involved and much more motivated to get the truth out.
We want the military also to do this. Some time ago, Barbara pointed out the fact that the explosions that happened in the Pentagon, even prior to the so-called whatever it was that hit it, that those explosions showed that this was pre-planned, and the fact that the Pentagon was hit allowed them to look at this as a potential military operation so they could declare their war on terror. That's really important.
That's right. Yeah, and let me just add for your listeners who haven't heard me say this on many of Scott's programs before, but exactly the same thing happened at the World Trade Center. In our grand jury petition, and I don't know if it's in the FBI lawsuit, but it's certainly in the grand jury petition, in the text, and also the evidentiary exhibits that are part of the petition, are the critical facts that there were massive basement explosions, deep basement explosions, in both of the Twin Towers, in both World Trade Center 1 and World Trade Center 2, before the planes hit either tower. Same thing at the Pentagon. Massive explosion at or around April Gallup's desk at 8:30, almost 8 minutes before the alleged hit on the Pentagon. The same thing both at the Pentagon and the World Trade Center. And any kindergartner knows that planes cannot cause massive explosions that killed many people and maimed many people before the planes even approached the building.
And let me just add, Scott, as one of the disclaimers that Dave Meiswinkel says we have to make occasionally, and Barbara's made some, and I've made some, but the Lawyers Committee is still investigating the Pentagon, so Barbara is offering her own conclusions there.
That's correct.
I just wanted to make that clear, but we're still looking at it and at all the evidence, and hopefully we'll get that evidence to a grand jury at some point.
Right. Well, I think you're moving in a very methodical, intelligent way. We know you have to win little victory by little victory before you win the war, and I can see that you're going to win the war because these maneuvers are very, very sound. The overarching authority that you have, of course, is the American people and the Constitution, which controls the very existence of government, not vice versa. And every heart in America realizes that. And I think internationally, too, is the other flag that is waiting to be woken up. And perhaps there's an international order of firemen that have a similar camaraderie in France and Britain and Germany or elsewhere that have said long ago their American brethren were sacrificed for a great tragedy and a deception. and that too may serve you to awaken that sleeping giant around the world, because firefighters do have that camaraderie, and I think you're doing a fantastic job.
Thank you, Scott.
Thank you.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, this is Scott Benner, Michael J. We're going to be closing now. Thank you very much for Barbara Honegger, Mick Harrison, David Meiswinkel. That was a fabulous presentation, and we are going to be advertising this and sharing with Revolution Radio. We are going to be attending the September Oakland, California 9/11 event, and we will be bringing Revolution Radio to that as well, and happy to interview the people who will be attending there. And it is a great day to hear such encouraging words, and I can't applaud you more, and I pray for God's blessing on all your work and protection in all your work from this day forward. God bless you. Michael J., I'll let you close this out.
Thank you, Heavenly Father. Thank you, Lord, that your throne is established in righteousness and in justice. And Father, we have seen a terrible crime against humanity, Lord, that was fomented and created, Lord, in America, where there were plans already in place and tyrannical laws set in place, ready to be released, like the NDAA and other kinds of laws, to put America under bondage, under a New World Order police state. Father, we have suffered as Americans, but millions and millions of others have suffered in this horrific crime against humanity, Lord. And it's an ongoing problem, an ongoing horror. We're asking your blessing, Lord, as you in faithfulness have raised up a standard, because the enemy of America has sure come in like a flood. Lord, we're asking, we're appealing before the courts of heaven. Let your will be done in the earth as it is in heaven, because you're a just and holy God, and you know exactly who did this and the level of their involvement. We pray, have mercy on America, have mercy on our president. Wake us up, Lord, and call us to stand before you, Lord, in truth and seeking your help in this time of trouble. We thank you, Father, for this in the name of Jesus, our Savior. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. We will see you next time.